that's, you know, if you want a story that should be told, that I don't see told very often, I think it's that one, is we are unique in that context. But anyway, we have this methane that's being belched out by these cows, and that has a global warming potential 23 times that of carbon dioxide. And that methane sits around in the atmosphere for about 8 to 10 years before it gets itself then converted back to CO2 and enters the cycle again. And that really is why we have this issue that methane, because it's being produced as a result of an industrial process, if you like. Farming is, you know, an industrial process. So it's anthropogenic, and it's sitting in the atmosphere, and it's causing global warming. And that's why, you know, the CPRS says, yes, it should be included. Anyway, that's, and I think probably Bob could explain a lot more elegantly than I can about how, why heat is trapped more by methane than CO2. It's a complicated biochemistry and physics that I don't pretend to understand. But, you know, that sort of sets the scene, I think, but I think there's real reason for optimism, and there are things we can do, and I think that's really the story I want to say is, yes, this is a cataclysmic event that seems to be heading in our direction, but I think there are things we can do to prepare for that or minimize the impact that it has. And one of them is, right here and now, there are things we can do today that we know will reduce the amount of methane an animal produces. So, for example, if you put oils in the diet, cottonseed or any oil seed, or fats, tallows or whatever, you put that in the diet in a feedlot, you will reduce the amount of methane that animal is producing. And generally it's about, for every 1% in the diet, you get about a fourfold reduction in the amount of methane. And that is being done in Alberta. The farmers that put fats in the feedlot diets actually get a rebate from the provincial government for doing that. So they are actually paid to do something which has been proven to reduce methane emissions. The other thing we can do, and this is relevant to Northern Australia or certain parts of Northern Australia, is looking at legumes in the diet. We know that legumes do reduce methane emissions, and we've got some data on that from Rockhampton. One of the ones that looks pretty promising is Lucina. So perhaps, you know, 10 years down the road, you would actually get some sort of credit for growing Lucina and including Lucina in a rotation or whatever. Now, obviously Lucina is not going to grow everywhere, but if we can find out what it is in Lucina, then maybe there are things that do grow in your part of the world that also have that same impact. And that is another part of the work we're looking at now, is looking at tropical forages and particularly legumes to see which ones have this impact. The other thing, and for Northern Australia and for the people in the pastoral industry, the big issue, the big thing that can really improve your methane footprint, the amount of methane you produce per kilogram of animal, is management, just change management. And it's really, the big thing here is days to market. If you can halve your days to market, you actually halve the amount of methane that animal is going to emit over its lifetime, simply because it doesn't live as long. And that is something that I think can be exploited more so here than in many other parts of the country. I think we have tremendous potential to look at what sort of management strategies that are available today to us that can have an impact on this. And we have to realize that as we enter into this, you know, carbon constrained era, there will be far more technologies become available to us, that simply because the economics will drive new thinking, new technology and new management production systems. So there is real opportunity there. And this is just an example of some work that Bob Hunter did, just looking at what if. You know, what if you, and I'll go through this fairly slowly because it's a bit complicated, but let's say your average rate of gain is about 0.3 kilos a day, and your weaning rate can be anywhere like a low of 65 and then up to something as high as 85. So those would be, you know, within the realms of possibility currently. Could you then, for example, get that average rate of gain up to 0.6 through improved pasture or whatever, or reduced stocking rate perhaps, or introduction of a legume? And then again look at the impact of that on, look at also adding to that a branding rate change as well. So Bob's looked at this and said, well, if we run just pasture on the yellow bars at the back, you're going to produce about 2.5 kilograms of, this is methane, not CO2 equivalent, so it's a different value, but quite high value. But if you then take that animal and take it off pasture and finish it in a feedlot, you can see that amount of methane per unit product has dropped from about 2.5 down to about 1.5. So that's a big chunk of methane you're not producing simply by finishing cattle in a feedlot opportunity as opposed to on pasture. If you decide just to stay on pasture but improve your average rate of gain, you still get a benefit, but it's not a small. But the point here is if you're already in southern Australia doing 0.6 kilos a day and you put the feedlot in there, you're not, yes, you improve, but the difference is going to be less than it would be for you people out here in the north. So again, I think this is an opportunity for exploiting, for thinking about, you know, as we move into this, if there is some sort of tax on carbon, what are the things we can do today that are going to minimize the financial impact of that on my property. And I think down the road there are real opportunities that will come along in various areas. One is genetics, and again this is something relevant for the north because we can't pop out there every day and put a pill down their throat or give them a supplement, but what we can do is improve the genetics, and there's a lot of research here and around the world looking at selecting cattle for low methane emissions, and it's early days yet. But if you think there's a selection program looking at what we call this net feed efficiency or residual feed intake, where we now have high and low lines for net feed efficiency. These admittedly are Angus cattle in southern Australia, but within a number of years the geneticists have found a divergence of lines for net feed efficiency. They've now taken those most efficient animals and they're looking at the methane emissions from those versus the least efficient, and they're seeing there is some relationship, and the hope is that we will in time develop low methane emitting cattle. Now provided that doesn't come along with some other trait that we don't want to select for, then that's a real option. The beauty about that option is it's there in the herd. You use those genetics, it's there in the progeny, and it's potentially additive over time. So there is a real possibility for significant reductions in methane emissions over time through genetics. The other one is dietary supplements, and obviously ionophores and monensin has been around for many years now, and we know that has a direct effect on feed efficiency, but it also has a direct effect on the amount of methane produced, typically 5 to 10% reduction in the amount of methane produced when you put an ionophore in the feedlot ration. Now that can often be transient and is not necessarily there for the long term, but at least it could be something that does help. There are others, halogens. We did work in Rockhampton a few years ago, and these things are so toxic that they're not even safe to feed, but just demonstrates that there are things that can knock out the rumen bugs that you want to knock out. And we talk about methanogens. Methanogens are a group of microbes in the rumen that they're the ones that produce the methane, and if we can eliminate those, then you can eliminate the methane. But the problem is, the reason an animal produces methane is the rumen is an anaerobic environment and it produces a lot of hydrogen, and typically in an aerobic environment you mix that with oxygen and make water, but you can't do that in the rumen. So the animal has to find what we call a sink for this hydrogen, and methane is CH4, so for every carbon it's got 4 hydrogens. So that's the sink that the ruminant uses predominantly to soak up that hydrogen to prevent the rumen getting toxic and killing off everything. So it has to have somewhere getting rid of this hydrogen. Now there are other pathways that can be used, and that's what kangaroos do. They use different pathways that don't end up in methane.